Would you kill one person to save 100? You've never had to calculate whether stealing a rival's water source is worth the subsequent revenge, or whether capturing a stranger is safer than letting them freely warn their loved ones. Your ancestors made such decisions, not just occasionally. For much of human history, dealing with enemies wasn't a metaphor. It was a daily, direct, sometimes deadly calculation. And the way they handled it wasn't simple. And it wasn't always what you'd expect. It wasn't constant chaos. It wasn't noble restraint either. It was something stranger, more structured, and in some ways more disturbing than either extreme. Let's start with the bones, because the bones don't lie the way stories can. In 2016, a team led by the Cambridge archaeologist Marta Mirazón Lahr excavated a site called Nataruk, near Kenya's Lake Turkana, and published their findings in the journal Nature. What they found were the remains of at least 27 individuals dated to roughly 10,000 years ago, among the oldest direct evidence of group violence in the human record. The skeletons weren't the result of a single skirmish gone wrong. Several showed their hands had been bound before death. Some had blunt force wounds to the head and projectile injuries from weapons that didn't match the local toolkit, suggesting the attackers came from outside the group. Pregnant women were among the dead. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a duel between two angry men. It looked like the deliberate, coordinated elimination of a rival group, camp and all. That's disturbing on its own. But what makes it more disturbing is what it implies. Organizing an attack like that requires planning. It requires people who agreed in advance on a target, a method, and a reason. Enemies to the people at Nataruk weren't abstract. They were specific, identifiable, and worth killing as a group project. But Nataruk is a single, brutal snapshot. To understand the ongoing relationship between ancient humans and their enemies, you need a site that shows the pattern over time, not just one terrible day. That's what makes Jebel Sahaba in modern Sudan so important. The cemetery there, roughly 13,000 years old, was first excavated decades ago. But a detailed reanalysis published in 2021 by the bioarchaeologist Isabelle Crevecoeur and her colleagues changed how researchers understood it. Using modern imaging techniques, they found that many of the dead had suffered multiple violent injuries at different points in their lives, some healed, some fresh at the time of death. This wasn't evidence of one catastrophic battle. It was evidence of repeated episodic violence, stretched out over years, consistent with a long-running cycle of raids and retaliation between neighboring groups. Someone attacks, someone survives, heals, and eventually retaliates. Someone else survives that, and retaliates again. Enemies in this world weren't defeated once. They were managed, feared, and fought, generation after generation. This pattern, a slow-burning cycle of raid and revenge rather than one decisive war, turns out to be remarkably common once you look for it across the archaeological and anthropological record. In his influential book, War Before Civilization, the archaeologist Lawrence Keeley synthesized evidence from dozens of small-scale societies, both ancient and more recent, and found the same structure again and again. Warfare between bands and tribes rarely looked like the organized, frontline battles of later state societies. It looked like ambushes, dawn raids, and tit-for-tat killings, often justified explicitly as revenge for a previous death. Keeley's work pushed back hard against the once popular idea that early humans were mostly peaceful, and that organized violence was a late invention of agriculture and civilization. The evidence pointed the other way. Small-scale, chronic, revenge-driven conflict with clearly defined enemies appears to be extremely old and extremely widespread. But here's where it gets more complicated than simple bloodshed. Dealing with an enemy didn't only mean killing them. It also meant deciding, constantly, who counted as an enemy in the first place. And that boundary moved. Captives were sometimes killed, but not always. In many documented small-scale societies, women and children taken in a raid were absorbed into the attacking group, married in, adopted, given new names and new kin. The line between enemy and relative could be crossed in a single generation. A person captured as a child might grow up as a full member of the very group that killed their parents, their status as outsiders slowly dissolving as they married, had children, and grew old among people who once would have killed them on sight. This wasn't mercy in the way you might imagine mercy today. It was often a practical calculation, A needed pair of hands, a needed womb, a needed ally, was sometimes worth more alive and assimilated than dead. Exile worked the same way, in reverse. Someone who violated the group's rules badly enough, who couldn't be trusted, who threatened the cohesion the group needed to survive, might be cast out entirely, stripped of protection, left to face the world's actual enemies alone. In many small-scale societies, banishment was considered a punishment nearly as severe as death, because a lone individual outside the group's protection was extremely vulnerable to exactly the kind of raiding and violence described at Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba. Exile turned a person from one of us into a stranger who could be killed by the next group they encountered, with no one left to avenge them. Now let's reconstruct a moment. You are part of a small band, somewhere in the deep past, camped near a reliable water source that took your ancestors generations to learn how to find and defend. A rumor arrives, carried by someone who ran half the night to bring it. A group from beyond the ridge, the same group that killed 2 of your people last season, has been spotted moving in your direction. The camp does not panic. It organizes. Some of the men take up weapons and move to the high ground. Others gather the children and the weakest members and move them toward a defensible position your people have used before. An elder, someone who survived the last raid, gives quiet instructions, calm and specific, drawing on memory rather than instinct alone. This is not chaos. This is a system built from repeated experience, refined the same way any other survival knowledge was refined, through trial, memory, and the brutal feedback of who lived and who didn't. The attack, when it comes, is short and violent. Afterward, the dead are mourned, the wounded are treated, and somewhere in the discussion that follows, someone raises the question of what happens next. Do you retaliate now, while anger is high and the enemy is weakened? Or do you wait, rebuild strength, and strike later when they don't expect it? This decision, made around a fire by people grieving their dead, is the same decision Isabelle Crevecoeur found written into bone 13,000 years later. The cycle doesn't run on hatred alone. It runs on calculation. Here's the counterintuitive twist. It's tempting to read all of this as proof that your ancestors were simply more violent, more savage, less capable of complex social reasoning than you are. But the deeper you look, the more that framing collapses. Deciding who counts as an enemy, when to fight, when to make peace, when to absorb a former outsider into the group, and when to cast out one of your own, requires exactly the same cognitive machinery you use today when you decide who to trust, who to forgive, and who to cut out of your life entirely. The stakes were simply higher, and the consequences were often lethal rather than merely social. Your ancestors weren't lacking the moral complexity to handle conflict thoughtfully. They had that complexity in full, and they needed every bit of it. Because getting the enemy question wrong didn't cost you a friendship. It could cost you your life, or the lives of your children. And this is the part that should sit uncomfortably with you. The basic architecture is still running inside you right now. The instinct to sort people quickly into one of us and not one of us. The impulse toward retaliation when you feel wronged. The pull toward reconciliation and reintegration when it seems more useful than revenge. The dread of being cast out, alone, unprotected, which still shows up as one of the most primal fears a human being can feel. None of this vanished when the weapons changed from stone to something else entirely. It just stopped being, for most of us, a matter of daily survival. So the next time you feel that flash of tribal instinct, the quick, almost physical sorting of people into friend and threat, know that you're not malfunctioning. You're running software that was field-tested at places like Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba, refined across thousands of years of exactly the kind of high-stakes social calculation that once decided who got to keep living near the water. You have never had to decide whether to kill someone from the next camp over, but somewhere in the deep architecture of your mind, a part of you still remembers exactly how that decision used to be made.